Hello and welcome to this new Jewish Narrative webinar. I am Hadar Susskind, the president and CEO. Thank you all for joining us on this day when you could be outside in the sun, except for the pollen count, which, as I was saying earlier, the pollen count today is all of it, unfortunately. The good news, however, is that we are being joined on camera even, there we go, hello, by a very special guest today, who I will go ahead and introduce. So our guest is Dr. Shibley Telhami, who's the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland, as well as the director of the Critical Issues Poll and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we haven't seen each other recently, but I took a class with Dr. Telhami when I was a student at University of Maryland. So it's been a while, but it is nice
Right,
to see
yeah.
you. And thank you for joining us today. There's a lot to talk about, but specifically we're going to focus on this new report, the Middle East Scholars Barometer, which you lead with Marc Lynch, and looking into this and, focusing really on the issues of self-censorship and censorship in academia under the current administration, what's going on. Obviously, the attack on academia and on professors is frankly part and parcel of the attack on law firms, on students, on nonprofits. So much of which is being done by this administration, really suppressing any kind of critical thought, any kind of critical dissent. And much of it, unfortunately, being done under the false guise of their efforts to fight anti-Semitism, so to speak. But we will get into that. So thank you very much for joining us. And why don't we just jump right in? We have shared both the report and the article about it in the chat. So everyone, if you haven't seen that already, you can take a look at it later. So hello, nice to see you. Thank you for being with us. Tell me about the
My
report.
pleasure. Thanks. I'll tell you about the report, and if you recall, when you asked me to speak before, I said let's postpone it for another couple of weeks because I may have another poll. And in fact, since then I had a poll which is among it was a national poll of American public opinion, not just scholars, that also tackled the question of censorship. And so I'll give you a little bit more of a feel of that as well. So. It's nice to join you. Let me just tell you a little bit about the Middle East Scholar Barometer, which we have been doing for several years now, which we do about twice a year. This is scholars of the Middle East, mostly political, slightly, well, I say more than the majority are political science. A majority are political science, more than half, I should say, are political scientists, in part because the two of us are political scientists, and also we have a advisory committee of 6 professors from around the country, and they're all political scientists. So we basically, but we also, for comparison, we go to members of the American Political Science Association who are political scientists, member of the Historical Association, and members of the Middle East Studies Association. So there's overlap, as you might expect, but we typically have a pretty good turnout. We have anywhere from 500 to 900 respondents. So we usually have a pretty good number to give us it gives you a pretty good picture of what's happening around. So the nice thing is what we've been doing, some of the questions even before Hamas's October 23 attack on Israel. So we had some ability to compare. Particularly on the issue of self-censorship. But we focused on that a little bit more, particularly after the attack and the war in Gaza. And so what we found throughout, really in every single poll we've done, certainly since October 2023, we did one late October 2023, we found that the large majority of scholars, we're talking about ranging about 80% on average. 80% of scholars say they self-censor when they speak professionally about the Arab-Israeli issue, the Palestinian-Israeli issue. So that's really important, professionally. We're not talking about, we sometimes a little bit, be careful with what you talk. We're talking about when you're talking in your classroom, when you're giving a lecture, a self-censor. And what we also found is that when you ask them, what is it that you self-censor most about, meaning criticism of U.S. policy, criticism of the Palestinians, criticism of the Israelis, overwhelmingly say 82% say criticizing Israel. And about anywhere from 10 to 12% say criticizing the Palestinians. Very few say they worry about criticizing U.S. policy, although that has begun to increase a little bit in the most recent poll. And go ahead if you want to ask.
No, I was just saying, I bet it has. I mean, it's obviously a
Yeah.
different, a different time in this 2-year time difference. I imagine quite changes that.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, we had the interesting thing is that this particular poll that we did at this round, we did it obviously after Trump came to office, and when we were in the middle of that poll, that's when he hosted Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and gave that Gaza plan that he did, and so we had like nearly half of the respondents were before he had that news conference and half after, so we could tell. And so, you could tell how it had chilling effects. So the number of people who said they tend to self-censor increased right after immediately by a measurable amount, by something like 10 percentage points or so. And they they shifted on a number of other issues actually that we discussed. So that was kind of interesting to see, like in real time, how people are reacting to this. Also, when you ask them, do you tend to self-censor more, uh, since Trump took office? We have 57% who said they self-censor more. And that's meaning what? You already had 82%, means it's more intense, meaning because typically people self-censor, but or feel they need to self-censor, they don't always follow through. Sometimes more than others, frequency is an issue. But when they say, now I feel really even a greater need to self-censor, it means it's more frequent, more intense. And so we see that happening. Now, one of the things that we did in that poll is actually give people an opportunity to say why and have an open-ended question. We summarized a couple of them in our article, but honestly, we have hundreds of responses with graphic descriptions. So much so that we're actually now doing an AI analysis of all these responses to see what the patterns are and how we can maybe make sense of them, because this is like a qualitative analysis, goes beyond the quantitative analysis. I should say, of course, just like you found in the quantitative part, 82% worry about criticizing Israel, 12% worry about criticizing the Palestinians. That shows in the comments. So a lot of the comments about disproportionately about worry about criticizing Israel. But of course, there are people who seriously worry about criticizing the Palestinians, who feel that the culture around them is so pro-Palestinian that they can't really speak out. I mean, so you find that description coming out of some of it. We're analyzing it now. We'll probably do, as I said, an article about it. Now, I have been at the same time doing U.S. public opinion related to self-censorship in the public. Now, it's weird that I would ask about the public because obviously, public doesn't really always engage in these issues. I mean, foreign policy is not exactly the driving force. But something, because these are hot issues, like the two big issues over the past couple of years have been Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Gaza, right? I mean, that's really it. And so we actually compare Ukraine with Gaza to see whether people tend to self-censor more on one or the other. And so we've asked that question recently as well. And what we found is that American public, of course, a lot of the American public says that, that doesn't come up for them. So we asked them whether they tend to be extra careful when they discuss this issue outside the home. That's how we put it, as opposed to, the scholars self-censor. And so what we found was that you have a lot more people say they self-censor on Israel-Palestine than on Ukraine-Russia. That's number one. So people tend to self-censor more on that issue. Number two, of those who self-censor, more people tend to self-censor on criticizing Israel than U.S. policy or the Palestinians. Whereas on Russia and Ukraine, they tend to actually more self-censor criticizing American foreign policy, especially now under Trump.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting shift. One final finding from a poll that we're just going to release in the next couple of days. I've just finished writing it up. This one we carried out that was on the campus stuff, but it asked the questions about whether they think that Trump's policies and actions toward American universities. We didn't really bias it by calling crackdowns or assault or anything of that. So just policy or actions toward American university were driven by, number one, confronting anti-Semitism, number two, confronting critics of Israel, number three, confronting critics of the administration. And so we found that, and we gave them, they could say all of the above. We said, which factors matter? We have somewhat and a lot. What we found is that 57% say the confronting the administration critics was a factor, a lot or somewhat. 54% said confronting critics of Israel somewhat or a lot, and 44% said confronting anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism was lost in the list of, to the American public, not the scholars.
Right.
So, and I'm actually just today, I finalized a new poll that we're going to do next week. That's a little bit of a follow-up to try to tease that out a little bit more from the American public.
That's fascinating. So I've got a question for you, but before I ask it, I neglected to remind everyone when we started, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom, not hand raised, don't put it in the chat, use the Q&A, and we will get to as many of those questions as we can. So the first one that actually came up for me as you were talking about this is, you're talking about scholars and their self-censorship and fear of criticizing Israel or fear of criticizing Palestinians or the American policy. Did you specify in there or in the comments in that open-ended section, did they say what it was they were afraid of? Like what
Yes.
things if?
Well, we even did that partly quantitatively. So we had a question saying, what is it you're worried about? You're worried about administration action. You're worried about your job. You're worried about student culture. You were worried about, colleagues' reaction. Those are worried about funding. So what we've seen really is that increasingly this time was worried about outside intervention, like doxing and government intervention, rose quite a bit more than the other factors. University culture is often one. People are worried about the reaction of administration, but not as much as the other things. There were examples of that given.
Administration, do you mean Trump administration or
No,
university?
I thought university administration. So there are, for example, people in the descriptive part who said, we were instructed not to use words like genocide or something like that, or the administration took me out of a panel because they didn't want to rock the vote, or things like that. I can say things don't happen at my institution that I know about, and I'm pretty close to my institution, but it's obviously happening in other institutions. Though, as I said, there are also the other side of the equation, people who say, that I really cannot express my views because my colleagues are so pro-Palestinian that I worry about defending Israel or something like that. Do you have that? But it's disproportionately the other way, as the numbers would reflect.
One of the questions that somebody just asked us here, but I was thinking about also is whether in the polling you make, you distinguish attitudes toward people versus regimes. So when you talk about Israel, do you ask them about, the difference between the Netanyahu government or the state of Israel? And likewise with, Palestinians, is that Hamas? Is that the PA? Do you make those distinctions in there?
Well, we don't really ask the questions in those ways, particularly for this. It's more about criticizing. I have to see whether we even said criticizing Israel or criticizing Israeli policy. I'm not. I have to double check actually right now. I don't have it in front of me, but we often will say Israeli policy, for example, or Israeli actions, in Gaza or something of that sort. But on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, that's a general question. It's not about Gaza and Hamas. So we're not even talking about the Gaza war. We had some questions specific to the Gaza war, and now I've designed some more of those for next week. Actually, I'm doing one that's specifically on that. But we really didn't, in part because some of those questions we were asking before October 7th, before the Gaza war, and we wanted to maintain continuity. So we'd have, basically, in fact, the original question was when you talk about politics of the Middle East, when you address Middle East, it wasn't even Israel-Palestine, and then we added the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Then we talked about criticizing the Palestinians. But I understand the kind of the reasoning behind the question. And for some questions, it might be useful to break it down and see, how people's opinions break down. Is it really what Israel is doing? Is it really attitudes toward the prime minister or the far right in Israel? Is it Israel and so forth? Those are worth asking. We have a lot of other questions, of course, in these polls that tease out a broader question, like two-state solution versus one-state solution versus Israeli interest and so forth that we probe.
Well, I'm curious what if any changes have you seen around the two-state versus one state? And when you talk about one state in the polling, do you define what that one state looks like? Because you obviously have people who are, one state sort of equal democratic state, and then you have people who are one staters on, Palestinians have no legal rights, one staters.
Well, the way we ask the questions are descriptive because we're not asking them what they want to see. It's not like they're, particularly scholars, these are the questions that are asked of scholars specifically. So we ask them, how would you define what now exists in Israel and the Palestinian territories, the West Bank and Gaza? Meaning, is it a one-state reality that is unjust? We have different three versions of that. Is it two states that are unequal? Is it an Israel with a temporary occupation of the West Bank and Gaza? So we have that question. And there we had increasingly a majority of, we've had for a while, a majority of the Middle East scholars who say what now exists is a one-state reality akin to apartheid. So that we've had that pretty much the answer for before October 7, 2023, and certainly continued since. But when we ask them, so what is likely to happen in the next 10 years? Is it likely that you're going to have a two-state solution based, on one in the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian state, and the state of Israel? Is it likely that there will be a one-state reality with equality between Israel and between Jews and Arabs? Or are we likely to have a continuation of the status quo as is? Are we likely to have ethnic cleansing? Are we likely to have, a one-state reality akin to apartheid, like they now say? And honestly, the one that gets the fewest takers would be that they would expect a one-state reality with equality in the next 10 years. and then followed by slightly larger number, still a minority, who say, very small minority, less than 10%, who say we're likely to have two states in the next 10 years. So people are very pessimistic. So the more likely they say status quo as we have it, or getting worse. And now we have a little bit more with the getting worse, particularly with expectation of ethnic cleansing. That question, by the way, you saw, because we had this Trump plan, as I told you, kind of announced in the middle of our poll. So we had it
And
before
how did
and
that shake
after.
out?
So a lot more people started saying yes, ethnic cleansing. There were a lot of people who were saying yes, they think there would be ethnic cleansing before a Trump statement. But you could see it in real time. It impacted the percentage of people who now said, yeah, there'll be ethnic cleansing. I mean, now Trump behind it. So
I mean, when the president of the United States says that, it's understandable that people would lean toward, again, not supporting
turn
that,
this off, but forgot to turn my
no problem.
okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
One other question that came in that I think is an interesting one. I know primarily, this last poll you were talking about is toward the scholars, but one Tom Feldman, who is our co-chair, who's going to join us at the end of this, asked if you, or if you know if anyone else has recently surveyed students around the self-censorship.
Yeah, it's really hard to do this, students. I mean, I could do it for the University of Maryland. I can get maybe others to do it in one institution, but nationally, it's the only one that I know that was really big among students was done right after October 7 and 2023, and that's the one that was done by University of Chicago. So they have some kind of a view of it. I should say that in our university, I have co-chaired the university task force with Professor Maxine Grossman, who is the chair of Jewish Studies on campus. I co-chaired the University of Maryland task force on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We did a joint task force. We issued the report. You're welcome to look at it. It was a pretty extensive report, both on the state of affairs on our campus and recommendations that came out of it. And that, it's out there in the public discourse. We posted it, university circulated it. But we tapped into a poll that was underway among our university community, including students, related to their level of comfort at the university, at our campus, particularly after October 7th. And we did, try what we asked them to include self-identified Jewish students, self-identified Muslim students on campus, because we wanted to compare that with the general student population at a time when we know, Muslims and Jews, whether they're students or not, were extremely uneasy and stressed for obvious reasons. It's a horrible war, and many people had loved ones. They knew a lot of people who were suffering one side or the other, so they knew they were suffering. A lot of people were uneasy, and there were reports. And even if you weren't necessarily directly uneasy in your own campus, you're hearing about what's happening in UCLA or Columbia or something, and you're worried, is it going to happen here? And you see protests. We had protests. So two things that were really interesting that I would talk about here is, number one, our finding was that the protests that happened both by pro-Palestinian students and by pro-Israel students on campus played within the rules. So we had them, and some of them were, high profile, but both groups played by the rules of the game. They didn't break the rules, and so it was kind of interesting to see in that sense. At a time when things could have exploded, they didn't. But the second is that the Jewish and Muslim students, and by the way, you may not know this, but on our campus, undergraduates alone, we have 6,000 Jewish students and 4,500 Muslim students.
Wow. I was about to ask you that, because I know ballpark the Jewish number. I know there are a lot of Jewish students. I did not know there was that many Muslim students.
Yeah, and that doesn't, by the way, include Arab students who are not Jewish, or who are not Muslim, I mean,
Yeah.
right? So we've got, I mean, we have a, huge population, and we have a lot of faculty, Muslim and Jewish, as you know, as well as staff. So we're really diverse. I mean, on this issue, we're really diverse, and that's one reason why we had this big joint task force. So that's a huge percentage of our undergraduate population. So the question was whether they felt less comfortable or not. And the less comfortable question was very uncomfortable and somewhat uncomfortable. And I can say that the very uncomfortable was not much higher than the rest of the population. So we have, like, overall on campus, we have maybe 2% who say I'm very uncomfortable. It was about roughly 4% for Muslims and Jews. The somewhat uncomfortable was a little bit higher than that. They were like maybe 5 to 6 percentage point higher than the rest of the population. And it was mostly among undergraduates. But when you ask people if this uncomfortable was in their immediate environment, meaning in classroom or for professors and staff, whether that was in their work environment, in the jobs and so forth, you found that most of the discomfort was external. They were not related to some of their immediate environment of work, not in class, not in work. And the other thing that was interesting is, in some cases, Muslim and Jewish professors and staffers were slightly more comfortable at UMD than the rest of the population during that period following October 7th. So we had some,
Speaks
the
very
number.
well of the university.
Yeah. So I think, and the image is not that, of course, this is because people are, they see an example that troubles them psychologically. They see it associated with something that happened somewhere else that led to violence. It scares the hell out of them. But that's why you really need good, empirical evidence to do this analysis.
Yeah. I mean, I have two college student children myself right now, and both of them are on campuses that have been thankfully relatively quiet. They're not on sort of hotspot campuses, and it's impacted both of them. And
Yeah.
that question exactly of comfort, because and thankfully they have not been around anything violent or anything, very aggressive, but the overall attitudes and the remarks, and I think it's it continues even today, well past, we're a year and a half plus past October 7th. It continues very powerfully. We got another good question that came in, and again, I encourage everyone to use the Q&A, please, to ask the questions, asking, beyond the barometer, what specific data shows a statistically significant increase in self-censorship for Middle East scholars compared to earlier periods?
Okay, so we really don't have, I mean, interestingly, I have not seen any. I think we're pioneers in asking those kind of questions, certainly related to Israel-Palestine. I will say that we had a poll that we did before October 7th, 2023, in which we asked scholars whether they self-censor when they speak about the Middle East broadly. And we found, pretty large number, maybe I think it was 57% who said yes. And we repeated that same question immediately after October 7th, separate from the one on Palestine, Israel, just to see whether, because we wanted to have a point of comparison. Did October 7 increase, the degree to which scholars were self-censoring? And we did have a spike. It went from, I believe off the top of my head, went from 57% to 69%. So there was definitely measurable change that took place related to that. So, I think that one of the things that one person asked about sort of the wording of questions, and one reason why sometimes the wordings don't, are not what you might like for a particular situation one of the benefits of having these polls, of course, is that the change over time. So sometimes you start with a question like the one we had on the Middle East, and of course then you need another one. So we tailor another one, but we still want to keep the old one because we want to see the change over time. So it helps us to track that. Now I have to say that one of the things that we are, in a way not coming to grips with because we're kind of flirting around the issue that put aside scholars, and we know scholars have their own views, and they're all under assault because everybody thinks they're liberals and lefties and everything else, and that's why they're even being called radical left, and universities be under assault in the name of fighting whatever. So okay, let's put that aside for now. Let's talk about public opinion. And we've already seen what I told you. I'm doing a little bit more on that to just see whether there's really self-censorship taking place, and the most fruitful ways to compare it with others, because you don't want to only focus on Israel-Palestine. You have to put in context. That's why I do Ukraine, Russia as a way. Is it different? You have to have a point of comparison. So we do that, but you have to look at some of the other trends that should lead you to know, even subjectively or analytically, where people stand. What is that like? For example, when you look at the Pew poll right now, that was just released last week, you probably saw it, and I'm sure a lot of the people, we're talking about, if you look at that poll, okay, the most interesting part of it is the comparative part, because they did one before October 2023, they did one in 2022, same questions, and then they do it 2025. So basically the same period before October 7th and after October 7th, right? And so what do we find? We find dramatic shift in the disapproval of Israel. So, it went from like 40, I don't remember, 40%, 41, 40, maybe 43% that had negative views of Israel in 2022. Now it's 53% having negative views of Israel. That's it. I believe it's
That's
over.
the frame, right? It's views of Israel. It doesn't talk about the Gaza war or details.
No. This is because they're tracking it over time. This is not related to the Gaza war. You see what was before, what's now. So what you find is that negative views of Israel have increased dramatically across the spectrum. Now, you look at Democrats, okay? They went from something like 51% negative views to 69% negative views. You look at Republicans, okay? Those that supposedly intensified their support for Israel, they went from 27 negative views to 37 negative views. And you look at older Democrats, and we're talking about 50 plus Democrats. Those are usually the ones that are least sympathetic with the Palestinians and more sympathetic of Israel. As you know, we're focused on young Democrats that have been far more, to the left of the rest, certainly on Israel-Palestine. The numbers, the largest increase happened among older Democrats. They went from something like 44% negative to 66% negative, 22 percentage points over that period, almost matching younger Democrats. Okay, so all right, if you're looking at that 53% have negative view of Israel, what are you expecting now just for them to think about any criticism of Israel? It's far more pervasive than the people who are going to admit it publicly. This is one of the best polls we have on those issues, because they tend to have really large numbers. When I'm doing my polling, I'm doing anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000. They do a lot more than that in terms of the sample that they have. They have a lot more resources to do it, and they do it well. I've advised them in the past. They're an excellent polling company, Pew. Now, okay, so put aside Pew. All right, look at Gallup's poll that was released recently. So what did Gallup poll show? Gallup poll showed that in the 25 years that they've been asking the question about sympathies, more sympathy with Israel or more sympathy with the Palestinians. 25 years ago in 2001, they had like less than 20% sympathetic with the Palestinians, less than 20%, I think it was like in the teens, and more than 50% sympathetic with Israel. Right now, 25 years later, for the first time, they have 57% more sympathetic with the Palestinians and 22% of Democrats, this is among Democrats only, 57% more sympathetic with the Palestinians and 22% more sympathetic with Israel. And for the first time in the Gallup poll, the sympathy with Israel dropped below 50% overall. So, okay, so yeah, I mean, so what I'm saying is like, okay, guys, it's not just about campuses. And you know what? I'll tell you another thing about campuses. So I did a poll among, I have a poll that wasn't related really to October 7th. I traced this over time to try to see American attitudes, prejudice toward Jews, prejudice toward Muslims, prejudice toward, I study prejudice separate from my foreign policy stuff. I'm obviously, this is something that I care about, we all do, basically, discrimination against people for their race, religion, or whatever. And so one of the questions was to trace attitudes, particularly toward Jews and Muslims in America, prejudice. Well, we know it's there. I mean, we know. I mean, basically, we know, first of all, the increase in numbers. Just look at the FBI. You don't have to take ADL because they've changed their measures. Look at the FBI numbers. They've increased over, 50% last year from the year before, whether it's incidents against Jews or incidents against Muslims. Yeah. But we haven't measured actual popular attitudes, and we measure that. So I have measures on, sort of prejudice toward Muslims, prejudice toward Jews in America, and their views of Jews and Muslims, are they positive or negative? I have multiple
You did this in the recent public poll?
Yeah, it's an American public opinion poll, and you can get that. They're all online. You can look at it. I usually accompany it by an article because I write an article. A lot of them published by Brookings, but also elsewhere, and you could find them. But this one, we controlled for people who have college education and people who don't have college education. And people who went to college invariably have much more favorable views of Jews than people who didn't go to college. It doesn't matter the age group, whether they're 18 years old or 80 years old. If they had college education, they have more favorable views of Jews than people who don't have college education. And people blame colleges, but it's not true, and there are a lot of reasons for it.
What about views of Muslims with that breakdown?
Also better. So both of views better, more favorable views of Muslims and more favorable views of Jews. And just without exception.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the numbers you were talking about support for Israel, support for Palestinians overall, many of us have seen all kinds of different polls and conversations and things. And what always amazes me, particularly in this last, 18 months since October 7th and the Gaza war, is people look at those polls and they write articles. And as you said, the numbers are different between Democrats and Republicans, but they look at those and they write articles as if it's a problem Democrats are having.
Yeah.
That Democrats are doing something wrong because their views have, are reflecting this. And again, I say this as somebody whose job is not partisan at all. I'm not making this as an argument in favor or against Democrats or Republicans, but I think it is a willful blindness to look at those numbers and think that those numbers are the result of either Republicans or Democrats and what they are doing, as opposed to results of what the Netanyahu government and the Israeli government are doing. That people aren't being asked, as a Democrat, do you like what Democrats think about Israel, or do you like what Republicans think about Israel? They're being asked their views about what's actually happening there and what the Israeli government is actually doing. And I find it amazing, but just over and over again, we see these articles and these comments and these debates about, who's pro-Israel? Is it Democrats or Republicans, as opposed to addressing the actual topics of what's happening on the ground. And I'm curious if in those questions, underneath, is there any, are people just asked what's your view, favorable or less, or are there any kind of issues or questions underneath that?
Oh, there are issues. And again, by the way, first on your Democrat versus Republican, as I said, in the Pew poll, Republicans have soured on Israel in the past 2 years by 10 percentage points. So 10 percentage points more Republicans now say that they have unfavorable views of Israel in comparison to 2 years ago. Okay, so all right, still, fewer Republicans have unfavorable views of Israel than Democrats. And second, independents do have soured on Israel. Forget Democrats and Republicans. So you look at the numbers, and all age groups, every single age group has soured on Israel. So it's not, so when you say issues, yes, of course. So let's start with what's happening in Gaza, and I did early polls right after the October 7th attack. Within actually 2 weeks, I did a big poll trying to find out whether American public views change on Israel, on Israel and the Palestinians. I have like a stock question, which I have been asking for like 3 decades, which is, do you want the U.S. to lean more toward Israel, to lean more toward the Palestinians, or to lean more toward neither side? And I use it for tracking over time. And so therefore, I already had a question. I had data from before October 7th, so I repeated it again after October 7th. I wrote a piece on it, and it's out there at the Brook Institution. It came out either late October or early November. It was, that time period. And it's basically, I found that there was a lot of sympathy for Israel that came across after the initial attack, and measurable. In fact, I argued at that time that while still a majority of Democrats wanted to lean toward neither side, the bump in the percentage of people who wanted to lean toward Israel was the single largest bump I have ever measured from poll to poll. So it was significant. And 2 weeks later, when of course now the bombings of Gaza had taken place, Israel lost most of that in the poll. So just 2 weeks later. Okay, so this has obviously been gradual, but so in the recent polling, including our own, which I wrote about 2 weeks ago in another article, which relates to how Americans see the war in Gaza. And when you ask them, is it legitimate action in self-defense? Is it war crimes? Is it illegitimate actions but not war crimes? Is it war crimes? Is it genocide? And so, what do we find? We find that, put Democrats aside for a minute, a plurality, 36%, say it is at least major war crimes. Okay? So we're talking about over a third of Americans think that what Israel is doing in Gaza is at least major war crimes. We have a majority of all Democrats think what Israel is doing in Gaza is at least major war crimes. And a good number who say it's either genocide or akin to genocide. So, okay, so, obviously the way people see what's happening in Gaza, I mean, if you hold these views, how are you going to be angry with people who are protesting the war? And if you're not saying that publicly, then of course you're self-censoring. And we know a lot of people don't say that publicly. You don't get the impression from what we see on TV or what people are talking about privately that those are the views that are being held. I'm not the only one. Mine is actually a bit more conservative findings. There were some polls that found a majority of Democrats who say what's happening in Gaza is genocide. I have not had that, in part because I ask the questions a little bit more conservatively, meaning I give them gradation.
Yeah.
And people sometimes, rather than yes or no, I give them gradation so they can distribute their answers a little bit more.
And I'm curious if you've got, obviously October 7th and the Gaza war, understandably been the big news in this space for a long time. If you've got polling both more recent but also consistent like that around settlements and occupation.
In the past, yes, of course, I have, and no question about it. People were very angry with that, and that mine wasn't the only poll related to that. In recent days, I haven't been asking about it because that's not really what's out there. I did ask about whether people support the idea of removing after the Trump plan. I asked the question about whether the American public supports the idea of removing Gazans. Fewer than one in five Americans said they support that. Fewer than 1 in 5 Americans. And that includes, of course, a minority of Republicans as well. And we asked them, in fact, whether they support, the idea of the U.S. taking over Gaza. And again, fewer than 1 out of 5 said they support it. So yeah, I mean, the public isn't there at all, for sure. I think that, where the public sees the issues is different. But I want to say something a little bit different to think about, okay, that people usually don't think about. I happen to think that criticism of Israel in Gaza was somewhat muted under Biden. Now, people say, well, what do you mean? Well, I mean because a lot of people knew the stakes. He was engaged in a fight against a tough electoral fight against Trump, and a lot of people didn't want to weaken him. And when he was sort of, some people criticized him. A lot of young people did. Maybe some people didn't even vote. But a lot more people were less willing to voice them. I've heard this from a lot of elected officials who said, I disagree with the president, but I'm not going to go out against him right now because it's going to weaken him, and I don't want to weaken him, right? So now it's a different environment. So who's the champion of the Israeli government right now? Who's the champion of the Israeli right now? Who's the champion of ethnic cleansing right now? Who's the champion of possibly Israeli annexation of the West Bank right now? It is Trump. And Trump is, you can see his popularity right now in America. It's tanking anyway. But among Democrats, obviously, I don't think any Democrats has ever seen another Republican president the same way they see this one, because of, forget Israel policy, it has nothing to do with it. It has to do with
everything else too. Yeah.
our democracy. Therefore, the association of Trump with far-right Israeli policy is going to get even more angry response toward Israel in America, both publicly and in public opinion. And I suspect I'm going to be tracking more of it as we move forward, as sort of anti-Trump translating into anti-Israel because of the identification that has been created.
I'm fascinated to see your data as you gather it, because anecdotally I definitely see that. I hear that from people who I know. I've had similar conversations with elected officials when Biden was still in office about not wanting to speak out publicly in ways that they feared would weaken him. And I think that there are more and more people who are very understandably equating Trump and Netanyahu and those regimes. And we talked about it a little bit, and we had a couple of questions about what does it even mean to say are you pro-Israel or have a favorable view? Again, are you talking about the existence of the nation, the current government? But as we get more and more alignment between Trump and Netanyahu, it is easier for people to conflate those two things, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
With that, I want to ask Tom Feldman, our co-chair, is going to join us to say hello and weigh in also. So Tom should be on screen in just a moment. When is this next poll that you said you're working on? Oh, here comes Tom.
We're going to field one next week, and then we're going to do another poll on Middle East scholars next month. So we're going to have more streaming data. So
excellent. Well, I look forward to it. And in the meantime, I will welcome Tom Feldman. Hello from Denver. I assume you're home.
Hello. Hi, Tom.
I had an opportunity to read the task force report that you put together for the University of Maryland. And I was struck by one of the recommendations of the report, and that was encouraging the university, your university, to give students tools to engage in difficult conversations. Obviously, Israel-Palestine is among the most difficult. And it also, the recommendation also involved helping students better understand anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. At the same time, since your report was issued last fall, the Trump administration has been attacking DEI initiatives on campuses, and I assume that has affected your university as well. So my question is, how difficult in this new environment would it be for universities like yours to implement the kind of programs encouraging dialogue that your task force recommended?
Oh, there's no question that it hurts. First of all, on our report, Tom, just to put it in some perspective, Maxine and Maxine was great co-chair. I mean, she was fantastic co-chair of the task force. We had 26 members. The 26 members were students, staff, and faculty. We had roughly an equal number of Muslim faculty and Jewish faculty on the task force. And as you can imagine, these are difficult and painful and challenging times, and not everybody saw eye to eye. And we wanted people to be frank. We weren't trying to hide it or put it under a rug. And yet everybody came together and we had a consensus report with no dissension. And in large part because we all understood that what's at stake was bigger than our individual feelings is really we need to protect the community, the academic community, the principals, to protect our students, to protect their safety, security, and to lean heavily on our mission as an educational institution, our educational mission, which was advancing understanding, which is part of our mission, and to show compassion to our members, because the compassion sometimes gets lost in this, because you need the empathy to be able to feel, look, I don't care whether my student is Jewish or Arab, Palestinian or Israeli. I mean, they are going to be hurting. I don't really care, and they have the right to hurt. You can't take that away from them. And if they're hurting for somebody they love, they're hurting for their own identity, they're fearing for their own, you can't take that away from them. You can't blame them for going through it. You got to give them the space to mourn loved ones, to understand what's happening around them, and you need to protect them. And so that was kind of like the approach that we took. And so in the recommendations, we leaned heavily on our educational mission as an institution, on our need to be compassionate, and on kind of encouraging education, forums for understanding and conflict resolution in a way that is that protects the rights of everyone. And we understood that you can't defend the rights of someone by taking away from the right of another. And so I think everybody understood that consensus. It led to a series of recommendations, the likes of which you recommended. Now, that you've recited. Now, with regard to DEI, which obviously, I mean, we are hugely diverse university. I mean, I gave you the numbers on Muslims and Jews, and proudly so. I mean, I love it for that because these are, of course, areas that I care about. And so I kind of like, I find it, I thrive in that environment. I love that. In my classes, I have obviously, Jewish and Arab students and Muslim students, and I love that. It's something that is vibrant. But of course, that's not the only diversity we have. We have a lot of blacks. We have a lot of Hispanics. We have a huge income diversity. Remember, we're in the state of Maryland. We're a state institution, and we are proud of that. This is not something that we're trying to hide. No, we wear that as a badge of honor for our community. And so, no, we're not going to pull back from it. And are we going to suffer from it? Yes. And we already have 40 different programs that have suffered from the withholding of funding, even without our university being directly targeted as one of those universities for now, right? So everybody is suffering. But do I tell you that there is not an increase in self-censorship? No, because I am hearing from colleagues and students and staff that they're all worried. And are they being as aggressive in highlighting, their focus on diversity? I'm not sure. And let me give you an anecdote on that. So, my college has nominated me, and actually I received it, nominated for my contributions to social justice and diversity. There's such a thing in the college. And so when I got that, I looked at it, and my first thought was, they must have asked every deserving person first and said, please keep me out of it. And they gave it to
I
me.
need that.
And of course, I was only half joking, but you get the point. Is that this is not something that do people want to put that on their CV? Do people are going to say out there public, oh, he's receiving a prize on contribution to social justice and diversity? But the point is, the university is not pulling back, and I think that is it going to cost us? Probably.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and that is both, sad, obviously, that there will be that cost, but I am glad to hear you and the university continuing this important work. So, Tom, thank you for joining us. Professor Telhami, as always, thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of this work, and we look forward to having you with us another time.